What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review episode 2 of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, a very solid episode called Hard Salt Beef. And I think I like this episode a little bit more than the season premiere, primarily because it managed to adapt quite a few scenes from the source material without totally screwing them up. Although there are one or two moments that were complete and total utter bullshittery, but we'll get to that in a minute. And that is basically the criteria by which I judge any adaptation of George R.R. Martin's work. However, there's one major or notable exception. Season 1 of House of the Dragon, the way they handled the character of Viserys, I was like, holy shit. Y'all found some newfound depth and poetry in that character and nobility in that character that was largely absent from the original material in Fire and Blood. But in general, anytime TV writers start mucking about with George R. R. Martin's text, the final results can be disastrous. But this episode was pretty faithful to the source material, so I should say it was written by Aziza Barnes and showrunner Ira Parker, and it was directed by Owen Harris, who also directed the season premiere. But I think one of the big reasons that this episode put a smile on my face is that it introduced one of my favorite characters from the original novella, the Hedge Knight, and that would be Baelor Targaryen, who's one of those rare Targaryens who doesn't lust after his relatives, and he's not constantly inflicting cruel and unusual forms of torture on everybody around him. He's actually a Targaryen who's full of nobility and a sense of purpose, and he's an honorable man, and people look up to him. Baelor, he's a fantastic character. And we also got to see some pretty lively jousting sequences, which introduced some much-needed action into the season, and in that the original source material, The Hedge Knight, is all about a tournament, sooner or later this show is going to have to give us either a melee or a joust or something along those lines. But I think that's about all I can say without going into spoilers. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, as I said last week, first read the novella. It fucking kicks ass. Then check out the audiobook. It's brilliantly performed. If you're into comics, you can check out the comic book adaptation, which is pretty goddamn good. And then you'll basically know all there is to know about the two most lovable characters in all of George R. R. Martin, Dunk and Egg. I won't say they're the best characters, but they're definitely two of the most lovable, because if you read A Song of Ice and Fire, or at least the 5 novels that are there, and if you read Fire and Blood, and then if you read A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, they're not a ton of characters where they're like kind of soft and cuddly and sweet and that sort of thing, but Dunk and Egg, you'd have to be a pretty hard-hearted individual not to root for this unlikely duo of characters. So with that out of the way, last spoiler warning, 3, 2, 1, let's talk about what went down this episode. And with these short episodes, there's not a ton to discuss or break down. However, I'm a big, giant fantasy nerd, so discuss it I shall, because it's very, very rare that we get a show or a movie within the fantasy genre that I can actually get behind and enjoy. Most fantasy shows these days are completely, totally unwatchable, but luckily there are a lot of fantasy novelists out there these days, as well as a lot of game developers who are doing incredible work within the fantasy genre. So I still feel very, very well fed when it comes to the fantasy genre in the modern age. But holy crap, apart from A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, it's slim pickings if you're a fan of fantasy. And obviously this is very fantasy light, because we're in that period in George R. R. Martin's timeline where there's not a lot of magic, there's not a lot of dragons. Like, dragons are part of distant history as far as they're concerned. So we kind of see the leftovers. And obviously the Targaryens, they're still the blood of the dragon, but the dragons have been dead for quite some time when the story gets underway. But let's start at the beginning with a scene that initially annoyed me, but then it transformed into a scene that I liked, because initially we're getting this flashback about Sir Arlen of Penetree and how he wasn't necessarily a noble knight or a great knight, but he never won any major tournaments, and he spent a lot of his time with whores. And we're treated early on in the episode with him walking out of the bedroom with this big, giant 12-inch prosthetic limp penis. And I'm no prude, and I'm down for as much nudity as HBO wants to throw our way. If they wanted to have wall-to-wall nudity from the first scene to the last scene, I'd be all for it. However, new rule, since this is HBO, and that's one of Bill Maher's things that he does at the end of his show, new rule: if you're going to force the audience to look at a limp, disgusting, flaccid penis, at a minimum there has to be a trade-off with one of the 3 B's, as people like to say: boobs, bush, or butt. And HBO used to thrive in that terrain for a long time, whether they're talking about The Sopranos or Deadwood or the early days of Game of Thrones or a show like Rome. Basically, all the incredible shows in the early part of the 21st century that helped turn HBO into the Rolls-Royce of cable TV. But a couple of years ago, HBO decided in their infinite wisdom to abandon that philosophy or that creative approach, and basically just subjected us to year after year after year of either tiny flaccid penises or long, limp, flaccid penises. But it's fucking gross. Show us some beautiful women. This is the world of Game of Thrones. Like, if you look at season 1 of Game of Thrones, you're just like, holy cow. It's like, it's night and day compared to what we get these days. And what annoys me the most about this trend is I suspect the writers of these shows think they're being really naughty and transgressive and edgy and, like, pushing the envelope by showing us, year after year of all these tiny flaccid penises. And I'm like, all right, well, if you think you're that hardcore, I call your bluff. Show us a penis that's brrr, rock hard if you really think you're being that edgy and transgressive and shocking, because I can handle it. I've seen many crazy things in my day, and so it takes considerably more than a fake penis to shock me. But I'm just wondering, who do you think you're entertaining or thrilling or exciting by including the shots? It's like the shit scene in the first episode, which a lot of people were annoyed by, where the theme song to Game of Thrones started to kick in, and then we see Dunk projectile spraying diarrhea all over the place. That's not from the short story, nor is the shot of Sir Arlen of Pennytree, or that scene included in the original short story. If anything, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and particularly the short story, The Hedge Knight, it's very chaste. It's like Dunk. He's not like a pervy knight, and he doesn't really hang out with pervy knights. He's a very pure and noble, very innocent person in a lot of ways. And I feel like including shit shots or flaccid penis shots or whatever the case might be, it clashes with the tone of the original source material. But maybe at this point, I've talked enough about penises in this video because there's only a 30-minute episode to talk about. Let's move on to another subject. But as crude and coarse and vulgar as those scenes with Sir Arlen of Pennytree might have been, they transition into some interesting scenes where we see Dunk's predicament, where he can't find anybody who remembers Arlen, who will vouch for Arlen, or for the fact that Dunk is his squire and is eligible to enter the lists, as they say. He's eligible to enter this tournament. So he's in a bit of a bind, a bit of a pickle early on in the episode. Which leads to an interesting scene with the Egg, where Egg basically says, why would you let anybody tell you which tournaments you can enter and which ones you can't? Like, show a little bit more brazen bravado. And I got to be careful how I say this, because while I'm talking about spoilers from this episode, I'm not unveiling spoilers from the book or from later in the season. But for everybody who knows who Egg is, obviously, Egg is beginning to show his hand. He's beginning to give leave a trail of breadcrumbs as to who he truly is. But obviously, Dunk at this point is totally oblivious and totally clueless. And throughout this episode, Egg continues to leave little clues as to what his true identity might be. Like when all the Targaryens show up at the tournament, and Egg's like, I think I'm going to go back to the camp and make sure there are no thieves lurking about. But Dunk, he's a big, what's that expression? Dunk the lunk, thick as a castle wall. So far, Dunk is totally clueless. But with the arrival of the Targaryens, we finally get to meet one of my favorite mean and nasty Targaryens, Aerion Targaryen, who's the son of Maekar Targaryen, and Maekar Targaryen is the brother of Baelor Targaryen. And I would say this, as noble and pure as Baelor might be, and as wise as Baelor might be, Aerion is just pure scum, pure filth. But the reason I like these stories, and the reason I like Fire and Blood, and the reason I like all this, I like seeing the most vicious, ambitious, just mean and nasty Targaryens doing what Targaryens do, treating the entire world as if its sole purpose is there to lick their boots. And there's a very interesting exchange with Dunk, where Dunk's trying to explain that he's not a stable boy, and Aerion just says, not clever enough. But that entire scene is word for word right from the short story. And I know it's petty that I keep judging the success of the show specifically on which scenes are included and how well they're adapted, but I love these books. And so it's like, if you want me to continue to be invested in these shows and invested in basically everything that HBO is doing with the world of George R.R. Martin, you got to throw me a bone and give me the occasional scene that comes right from the text. And that scene was chef's kiss, straight from the story. And while Aerion might have simply come across as like a spoiled, pampered prince in that scene, trust me, there are some vicious deeds coming our way which will keep you thrilled and delighted in the episodes to come. But that scene is followed by an encounter between Dunk and two members of the Kingsguard where, once again, I got to be careful about spoilers, but let's just say Dunk is inspired by a story that he misinterprets because he learns that Sir Donald comes from a family of crabbers. He's like, oh my God, like how did the son of a crabber become a member of the Kingsguard? You can tell he's getting really inspired about his future prospects as a knight. And of course, later on in the episode, Egg tells him, well, his family's incredibly wealthy and has like an entire fleet of ships. Like they're the wealthiest crabbers in all of the Seven Kingdoms. So Sir Donald was pretending to come from more humble origins than he actually does. However, the purpose of the scene was to inspire Dunk to aim high. This whole episode basically is about inspiring Dunk to aim high, because he realizes while Sir Arlen of Pennytree, he taught him the values of being a good knight. He taught him the basics of a sword and shield and that sort of thing. Dunk, you can tell he wants to set his sights a little bit higher than what Sir Arlen of Pennytree accomplished in this life. And the good news is he has 4 more episodes with which to prove himself. And if they can adapt half the scenes to come as well as they might, I think we're in for a great thrill ride for episodes 3 through 6. But my favorite scene by far this episode, and the one that was adapted the best from the source material, was the one where Dunk bumps into Maekar and Baelor as they're discussing where Maekar's 2 sons might be. 2 of his sons have gone missing. But the conversation very quickly shifts to Dunk's dilemma, where he can't find anybody to vouch for him or for Sir Arlen of Penetry. However, Baelor, he's incredibly wise, and he's very familiar with most of the knights within the Seven Kingdoms. So he starts asking Dunk a few simple questions about tournaments with like the Grey Lion, Daemon Lannister, or more importantly, what went down between Baelor and Sir Arlen of Penetry when they jousted back in the day. And of course, stories grow in the telling. And when Sir Arlen of Penetry told the story to Dunk, he claimed that he and Baelor broke 7 lances before Sir Arlen was finally unhorsed. However, as it turns out, it was only 4 lances, however. But long story short, Baelor takes a liking to Dunk and tells him that he's more than welcome to join the tournament. However, he's going to need to find a new device, a sigil of his own, because he is not of Sir Arlen's blood. So he needs to have his own device on his shield, which leads to a little innocent flirting with Tansel, the big love interest of this story. And once again, the story as written in the original novella is very chaste and very innocent. Dunk doesn't know a thing about women. He has a vague idea about what might be under their clothes, but he's pretty naive about the ways of the world. But Dunk and Egg meet Tansel at a puppet show, and after the show, it's Egg who comes up with the idea of having a big elm tree on the shield. However, what Dunk wants to add is a shooting star, because if you'll remember, he saw a shooting star in the previous episode. Now, I know I've said some harsh words in the past about writers trying to make contributions to the world of George R.R. Martin, but there was one small contribution that I liked because the scene was brief, but it gave us a little action and it gave us a little humor. That was the tug of war, where we get to see, like, Dunk hasn't had a chance to really show off his skill so far in this season. And it's like, are you really going to make us wait till the end of the season before we see what Dunk can do? But obviously, Dunk is tall and he is strong, and he digs those heels in for the tug of war. And I like seeing how Egg, he's not even really helping. He's just hanging from the rope, but Egg loves combat, he loves action, he loves competition. Egg is basically like he reminds me actually a lot of my little nephew William, where all he thinks about and all he talks about is basketball and football day and night. He's totally fucking obsessed, but he's this scrawny, skeletal little kid. He's like Gollum, or it's like he has no muscle of any kind, but he's got all the spirit of like a 6'6" total badass. And that's what Egg reminds me of as he's trying to help in that little tug of war scene. But there was another scene that was very successfully adapted from the source material, and that would be the negotiation with the blacksmith, Steely Pate. And Steely Pate, he's a pretty straightforward, kind of down and dirty guy. He doesn't believe in putting a lot of finery or decorative bullshit on the armor. He's a big believer in just good, plain steel. However, his good, plain steel serves a knight better if they happen to catch a lance in the face. And let's just say there's a lot more jousting to come later in the season, but it was a simple scene, and it was a very direct scene and a pretty brief scene. But once again, it was adapted more or less word for word from the source material, so it just always makes me feel like I'm in good hands with the show if they're paying attention to the little details. And then finally, the episode treats us to some fantastic jousting, where we finally get to meet the character of Prince Valar, Baelor's son, who's second in line to the throne. And maybe I should save my commentary on Valar for subsequent episodes, but it's just, there are like 4 or 5 major Targaryen characters in this season, and I know sometimes people get a little annoyed trying to keep all the Targaryens straight because a lot of them look alike and talk alike and that sort of thing. But anyway, Prince Valar, he's a major character, and we got to see him do a little bit of jousting in this episode. But as always with the jousting, part of the fun is just watching Egg completely and totally lose his shit. He's sitting on Dunk's shoulders, just like taking it all in. He is the world's biggest fan. All he wants is to be a squire and then a knight and be a big, strong guy, just like Dunk. But he really loves watching combat and just watching him scream. And we see it in the teaser for the next episode as well, with him just losing his mind, watching more of the tournament. His reactions, the young actor, the actor is Dexter Soul Ansel. Very well cast. I mean, looking for child actors can be a tricky business, and you never quite know what you're going to get. But so far, I think the casting of Dunk and Egg has been an absolute slam dunk, and that's what's keeping me engaged in the show. But as far as criticisms go, I think my only real critique of this episode is that it kind of ended on not a downbeat note, but just kind of a nothing beat. And they try to create a little mini arc out of this episode where Dunk's like, look, all the things that Arlen never accomplished in his time as a knight, I'm going to go into this tournament, I'm going to kick much ass, and I'm going to achieve all the things that he never got to. So the arc was complete. It just didn't give us much of a cliffhanger with which to get excited for the next episode. And admittedly, in a 118-page novella, much of which is pictures, there's not a lot of obvious episode breaks to give us those cliffhangers that Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon are famous for. So I think the ending will serve. I just worry, though, that casual fans of the world of Game of Thrones are going to be like, what is this show? Who are these characters? Why am I watching this? Why does it feel so kind of slender and disposable? But this is not supposed to be some great epic. If you piece together all the novellas, or at least the 3 novellas here and the 2 unwritten ones, and there are some outlines in terms of like the timelines for what went down with some of these characters in the novellas that have yet to be written, and to be honest, probably will never be written. So taken as a whole, it becomes an epic. But as a standalone season, I get it. Some people are like, you know what? There just seems to be not enough meat on the bone, but that's the whole point. They're not trying to hit the home run with this story. They're just trying to get on base. And if they can get on base, they can get to second base in the second season. They get to third base in the third season. And maybe if George R.R. Martin starts drinking a lot more coffee and stops working on all these other side projects, maybe he'll write the novellas for 4 and 5 before the show ever gets there. But let's be realistic. That's probably not going to happen. But I think that's all I've got to say about this episode. I think so far, if you put these 2 episodes together, I'm very encouraged. I think it's about as strong or perhaps a little stronger than the second half of season 2 of House of the Dragon. Like House of the Dragon, season 2 had the benefit of that episode 4 with the incredible dragon battle. It was like, oh my God, this is just a fantasy lover's delight. But then season 2 completely and totally fell off a cliff by the end with some character changes and no battles and blah, blah, blah. But I remain very encouraged about A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. But if you're looking for some other stuff out there to read, to get excited for future shows and movies, this is unrelated to George R. R. Martin or the fantasy genre. But right now, I'm reading Project Hail Mary in anticipation of the movie coming out in March. If you're looking for some really granular kind of problem-solving sci-fi, Project Hail Mary will keep you entertained, and I'm very excited for that movie come March, but I'm officially getting off topic. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell. I would greatly appreciate it. But I hope everybody has a great week, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.